In this lesson, we're going to look at recycling of materials. We're going to look at the processes of recycling particular materials, and we're also going to evaluate the pros and cons of recycling materials. So to get us started, what I'd like you to do is to write definitions for the following key terms: finite, renewable, sustainable, reuse, and recycle. And then I want you to give the differences between recycling and reusing. So our key terms that we need to go through, we'll start with finite. If something is finite, it will run out. So a finite resource is a resource that will run out. A renewable resource is a resource that will not run out. A common mistake people make is they think that renewable means it can be used again. But actually, renewable just means a resource that will not run out. Sustainable, so if something is being used sustainably, it means it won't run out at the current rate of consumption. Okay, so that rate of consumption is really important because you can have a finite resource, but as long as you are using it sustainably, it won't necessarily run out. So by definition, when you're thinking if something is sustainable, you're thinking, well, will it be around for future generations? The rate at which we're using it now, will it be around for future generations? So if we look at something like crude oil, we are using it at a rate now that means that it will run out for future generations. It is not sustainable. So reuse is to use again for the same purpose. So for example, reusing a bottle. I'm sure we've all got water bottles that have been reused and filled up with something else. As opposed to recycling, where you're using the raw materials for a new purpose. Perhaps instead of reusing that water bottle, you've recycled that water bottle and the plastic has been used to make something else entirely. So how is recycling different to reusing? So in recycling, there are no new raw materials needed. And if you reuse, it means no new materials or manufacture required. So recycling, there's still a manufacture required. You still need to, recycle your material and then manufacture it into something else. Whereas reusing it, there's no need to manufacture. So there is no new raw materials or manufacture required. The next thing I'd like you to do is to research how we recycle different materials. The materials I want you to look into are metal, glass, paper, and plastic. Now use whatever resources you have available, textbooks, revision guides, and the internet. Look into how these materials are recycled. And I want you to summarize each process using a flow map. And remember, we're trying to summarize those processes, so your flow map should be 3 to 4 boxes in length. So I want you to summarize the process for recycling metals, the process for recycling glass, paper, and plastic. Okay, so I'm going to go through the summarized processes for recycling these materials, and if you want to add to and correct your flow maps using green pen. So for metals, the first thing we need to do is to collect and separate the metals. Once that's happened, we want to melt them. And importantly, this means a high temperature is required. It's worth making a note of that. And then once they've been separated and then melted, they can be recast. Okay, so those are the three main points for the recycling of metals. We need to collect and separate the different metals. We need to melt them using a high temperature, and then we can now recast them into whatever form we want them to be in. For glass, we also want to collect and separate into type or color. I'm sure you've seen, if you go to a bottle bank, there's different bins for different colors of glass. Once they've been separated, you want to crush them into shards. Once they've been crushed, they can be melted. And again, high temperature required for this. And then finally, we can recast or reform. The glass. So this one has 4 main stages. Right, so for paper, again, we want to collect and separate into type. For example, cardboard. You don't want to be recycling the cardboard with the paper, you need to separate them into types. We need to sort of mash it into a pulp, so you add water and sort of break it down into sort of a mush. And we're going to use a chemical wash and bleach. Okay, and those do 2 things. The chemical wash is to remove the ink, and the bleach is to whiten the paper. Otherwise, we're going to end up with sort of almost like that sort of brown papyrus type paper. It then needs to be rolled out and pressed and dried. And then once it has been dried out and pressed, it can be cut to size. So again, 4 steps to this one. Finally then, plastics. Once again, collect and separate by type. Not all plastics can be recycled, and not all plastics can be recycled together. They need to be separated into different types of plastics. Then they are crushed into a block. Then they're shredded into microplastics. To microplastic pellets. And then finally, they can be melted melt the pellets and recast the plastic. Okay, so just make sure you've added to yours and that you've made any corrections that you need to in green pen. Now that you've researched and summarized the recycling processes for different materials, I now want you to evaluate the benefits and cautions of recycling materials. What are the pros and cons of recycling materials? So for our benefits and cautions of recycling materials, again, add to your own using green pen or make corrections in green pen. So the obvious benefits are that we're able to preserve raw materials. If we recycle materials, then there's no need to extract more raw materials. Now, these raw materials are usually finite materials. Therefore, it's more sustainable to recycle. We have a lower energy cost. Recycling does require energy, of course it does, but it has a lower energy cost than the extraction of the raw materials in the first place. Therefore, there's less combustion of fossil fuels involved. And therefore, lower CO2 emissions compared to the extraction of raw materials and making new products out of raw materials. So the drawbacks, it's a slow process. It's not very efficient. I think there's lots of different plastics that can and can't be recycled. It's all got to be sorted. It's all got to be separated. It's quite an inefficient process. It requires energy and transport. So it has energy cost and transport costs. All of these materials need to be collected and separated and sent to different places. And therefore, if it's got an energy cost in transport, there is going to be some combustion of fossil fuels. And therefore, there will be some CO2 emissions. But importantly, there would be less than if we just used the raw materials. Finally, I'd like you to try and apply your knowledge by answering some exam questions. We've got some basic recall of knowledge, assessment objective 1 questions. We've got some application of knowledge, assessment objective 2 questions. And finally, we've got some evaluation and analysis, assessment objective 3 questions. So let's go through these exam questions quickly. Again, make corrections in green pen. So steel and aluminium can be separated by the use of a magnet. Explain why. Because iron is magnetic. And steel contains iron. Whereas aluminium is not magnetic, so only the steel will stick to the magnet. Give 3 reasons why it's important to recycle materials like steel. Okay, finite resources. Okay, the metals used in the alloy to make steel are finite. It's non-biodegradable, which means it would, if we didn't recycle it or reuse it, it would go to landfill. So it's non-biodegradable. So it would go to landfill. And obviously we have a lower energy cost to recycle. So we would have less impact on the environment if we were to recycle as opposed to extracting more raw materials. What is paper made of? It is made from lignin or cellulose, which is a natural polymer that you find in plants. Why is it important to reduce the amount of new paper being made? Well, you've got the energy cost of the production. You've got deforestation, destruction of habitats, and you've also got the high water cost. It requires a huge amount of water to make paper. It's really high water consumption. What is the largest cost in recycling? And it's actually the transport and separation. The next question then, glass can either be made from sand or recycled from used glass. Both materials need to be melted before they can be turned into new glass. That is true. Used glass has a lower melting point than sand. Explain why it's an advantage to recycle used glass rather than use sand to make glass. It has a lower energy cost. Used glass bottles need to be separated into different colours before they can be recycled. Explain why this is a disadvantage. It's a slow process and it's expensive. Glass bottles can easily be separated from plastic ones. On what property could this be carried out? You could use buoyancy. If you place them all into water, only the plastic ones would float. Glass is made from silicon dioxide. Describe the structure and bonding in silicon dioxide. It is giant covalent. Remember the examples of the giant covalent substances. You've got silicon dioxide and you've got the allotropes of carbon. Explain why silicon dioxide has a high melting point. Because it has strong covalent bonds. In a giant lattice. And lots of energy is needed to break them. Okay, last question. Supermarkets in the UK have been advised by the government to stop giving plastic bags to customers. The government states that this is because plastic bags use up resources that are not renewable and that the manufacture of plastic bags produces carbon dioxide. Most of these plastic bags are made from polyethylene. The table below shows the methods to deal with large numbers of used plastic bags. Use the information and your knowledge and understanding to briefly give one advantage and one disadvantage for each of these methods. So, say advantages, disadvantages. So we'll start with reuse. So advantage, if you reuse it, you preserve the finite resources. Disadvantages of reusing it, well, it's still made from polyethylene, so we still have the CO2 emissions. So you still have the CO2 emissions from the manufacture, from the original manufacture. Recycle. So again, we can preserve the finite resources by recycling it, not using any more raw material. But obviously there's an energy cost associated. It needs to be collected, transported, washed and melted. So we have an energy cost. Therefore, more CO2 emissions. We have burning it. So it can be burned and it can produce heat. So the heat could be useful. So heat could be used. So that potentially is useful. But again, it's plastic. When you burn plastics, you're going to get harmful emissions. And finally, you can dump it. Well, the advantage is that it's quick and cheap. Doesn't have to be sorted, it can be mixed in with all the other household waste, so no additional requirements. However, it's non-biodegradable. So it will just stay in the landfill and wouldn't actually break down. So make sure that you have given advantages, at least one advantage and at least one disadvantage for each one of those, and that we have used information from this table as well as our own knowledge to answer that question. And again, make additions to your answers and corrections in green pen.